Welcome for the panel 3 of this afternoon about the topic of contested lines, borders as spaces of negotiation, fortification, and innovation. We will have the pleasure to hear Professor Saddiki from the University Sidi Mohamed Ben Abdellah in Fes, Morocco. We will have the pleasure to hear after Said the expert economist Renaud Bellais from the University Grenoble Alps. He will speak about the rise of a wall of data, border control beyond concrete walls. After Renaud, we will have the pleasure to hear Philippe, Professor Philippe M. Frowd and Professor Ken N. Multu from the Acadia University and Philippe M. Frowd from Ottawa University. They will speak about the rise of border security apps. Said, you have the floor.
Thank you, Benjamin. Good afternoon, everyone. The main argument of my paper is that the construction of border walls in the Levant reflect the region's fragmented and anarchic political environment. Let's start by clarifying the scope of my paper. The Levant is a historical and geographical region in the Eastern Mediterranean, typically including Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Palestine, Israel, and in some definitions, parts of Turkey and Iraq. For the purposes of my paper, the northern border of Syria with Turkey and the eastern border of Syria with Iraq are part of the broader Levantine region according to this definition. From the 16th century until World War I, the region was under Ottoman rule with flexible borders that lacked strict linear boundaries between its provinces. However, the arrival of European colonization reshaped the borders of the region. Approximately one-third of the boundaries established by the colonial powers are straight-line borders. Unlike Cold War-era fortifications, which were primarily focused on military defense, border walls in the Levant, like other post-Cold War walls, are designed to restrict cross-border movement, shifting the security focus to policing in response to external threats posed by transnational non-state actors. The two center states most involved, whether actively or passively, in the process of fencing and militarizing borders in the region are Israel and Syria. Israel has constructed security walls along almost all its seam lines with Palestinians and Arab countries. In contrast, Syria is the state most targeted by security walls built by its neighbors. Let's start with Israel, often seen as a wall-building state. Its border fortification policy reflects deep concerns about external security and geopolitical control. A clear example of this can be seen along the Israeli-Lebanon de facto border, where Israel has built multiple security barriers since its creation, including electrified fences, minefield, patrol routes. But breaches like Hezbollah 2006 attack show their limits. Following the October 7th attacks, Israel is likely to further militarize their frontier, investing in aerial surveillance and expanded defense. On the eastern side, Israel border with Jordan tells a different story. Although traditionally stable, recent tensions after the October 7th attacks have revived Israeli plans for a high-tech fence. In 2024, Israel approved a project of $1.4 billion to fully secure the Jordanian frontier, reflecting ongoing regional distrust and fragile peace. Moving north, Israel's Syria border reflects both security fears and territorial ambitions. After occupying the Golan Heights in 1967, Israel fortified the area and has recently expanded control into Syria's demilitarized zone following the collapse of Assad's regime in 2024. In contrast to Israel, Syria today is a country surrounded by walls built by its neighboring countries. Starting with Turkey, in response to growing threats from the Syrian conflict, Turkey moved from a flexible border policy to much stricter one. It's built a 110-kilometer wall, one of the longest in the world, to stop foreign fighters, Kurdish groups, and irregular migrants. This Turkey's strategy is also closely linked to European Union migration policies, particularly after the 2016 migration agreements between European Union and Turkey. The Iraqi-Syrian border was heavily secured under Saddam Hussein and Hafiz al-Assad, but after 2003, it became porous and was exploited by jihadist groups like ISIS. In response, since 2018, Iraq has started constructing concrete fences along parts of its border with Syria. Despite these investments, the border remains insecure, and measures have negatively affected local communities. Syria's southern border with Jordan had long been stable, but the rise of ISIS and other armed groups led Jordan to tighten its border control in 2014. The Jordanian high-tech electronic fence plan has been supported heavily by US funding. Zooming out to the broader regional picture, the Levant today is a fragmented subsystem shaped by persistent crises since the establishment of Israel in 1948. This fragmentation, coupled with intense competition between regional powers like Turkey, Iran, and Israel, has led states in the region to rely largely on external alliances and militarize their borders. These borders fortifications address immediate security concerns, but also reflect deeper structural problems within an anarchic and competitive regional system. To conclude, while the Levantine borders have faced many challenges over the past 2 decades, including attempts by groups like ISIS to erase colonial borders, the dominant trend has been the opposite, a reinforcement of borders through walls and militarization. This shows that, far from disappearing, borders remain central to state sovereignty and survival. However, as cases like the Hamas breach of Israel's Gaza fence on October 7th remained as, walls may delay threats but cannot eliminate them entirely. State must recognize that true security requires more than just physical barriers. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Said, for this great overview about the border wars movement in the Levant. Now I will give the floor to Renaud Bellais from the center CESICE, and you will explain us a bit what is it in the University of Grenoble in France.
Thank you. Thank you for this opportunity to discuss. I would like to come back, in fact, for about the research agenda we mentioned before, because I've been coming here for a few times now, and I guess we can build up on this trajectory about future research. So my questioning was about what you said, Said. Do we need to have a physical militarized border or not, and how we can enforce this sovereignty you mentioned just before? Because the idea is for states to keep control over territories as a means to avoid any loss of control. And the physical border is one which was chosen by many countries, but at the same time, we have seen over the 20 last years some militarization of this border. And my question is it relevant, and how the militarization can express itself in the future years? What are the main issues we have to look at to be sure not to miss something? So the first question is, do we have a market for defense companies in border security? It has been since 9/11 and the terrorist attack in 2004 in Europe. A big question. Indeed, we have a market which is quite relevant. Elizabeth mentioned $17 billion market in 2011, and if we look at consultancy working on those markets, they estimated that we have $37 billion in 2023, and it should reach maybe $60 billion in a decade. So there is a market, but actually it's not the market defense companies are looking for, because it's a very small portion of what they can find for military equipment, in fact. And so also we can raise many questions about the effectiveness of military means, because when you look at the way of military forces operate, they look at targeting some specific space for a limited time. We have this military awareness, which was in doctrine for a while, is difficult to achieve and could be very expensive to do so. Nevertheless, we see that even though defense companies were not looking for any more security markets, if you look at the biggest company, they are not looking at that market. And even if you look at the R&D part of the studies, usually it's small companies or research centers which are interested by this research, not the largest companies. Nevertheless, when you look at Frontex in Europe or other large agencies, they still are looking at technology as a solution, maybe like a silver bullet, to find a way to enforce their policy. But at the same time, this intensification, the switch from a labor-intensive to a capital-intensive approach of border policy shows some limits. Indeed, we have the use of drones, space imagery to support, but at the end, it's a small market. Resources are quite limited. And even though we have some planes and drones operating over the border for Europe, it is increasing, but it's quite too limited to cover the largest area we have. If you look at the European borders or American borders, it's too large to enforce such policy, which is maybe available and affordable for Israel, for instance, or a small country. But at the end, it becomes very difficult to enforce. We have this technological-centric paradigm still ongoing. If you looked at Frontex projects, they had in February Industry Day dedicated to artificial intelligence, for instance. But somehow it's quite surprising, because they are looking for more a seamless border mainly, and they use metery capability, but to limited resources. And so we have a temptation to have an automating fortress approach, which is quite difficult to enforce. What we can see is that if we look for limes, like a limit control in the Latin sense, yes, we have some limits. First, it's difficult to contain because to contain any flow would require to have no hole in the net, which is quite unachievable for large. And if you look to military means, they are not able to enforce such control. Look at Afghanistan, for instance. It was a failure and very expensive. You can have military tactics when you are looking for stocks, but not for flows. And sometimes you have the illusion, as I mentioned before, of the permanent awareness we can have. So if we look at the future we can have, in fact, we have a big change now. We thought 15 years ago of a spin-off from military technology for security border. But what we can see now is a dynamic even for defense is not the same. We can find many new innovations coming from civilian activities supporting military operation. And I guess the dramatic natural experiment in Ukraine is supporting this view. We had very traditional legacy systems which could be useful, but not that useful, especially when you want to have a very unbalanced asymmetrical approach of forces. We have a lot of new solutions coming from the civilian world with specific features. First, we have a level playing field between defense and non-defense technology at the benefit of the non-defense side of the dynamics. If you look at AI, big data, autonomous systems, and we have a lot of spillovers in defense. We have Palantir, Helsing, and other startups coming, proposing new solutions. Then we have also, that's the first transformation is the side of technology. Also in terms of industry, we have a big transformation pushed by the war in Ukraine. We have a change of scale on development of capabilities, especially drones and autonomous systems, which could be very useful to lower the cost of enforcing border policy. And we have also a lot of new resources, the third dimension, with especially the satellite constellation providing a very cheap access to Earth observation or communication. And we have also newcomers with a new perspective, because when we are looking for military solution for border security, it was transferring the same approach with very expensive, sophisticated solutions, which are not very useful to manage a large territory. But we can see that the newcomers are cost-driven. They are looking for a good enough solution, and they would like to have a strong user-producer interaction, and they don't rely on existing approaches. And that could transform the way we are looking at borders, because thanks to all those cheap and off-the-shelf solutions, we could have another view of space control with a lot of information processed and available to understand what is going on, even though we don't have any resources on site. It's also a way to minimize the force engagement, a way to avoid an overextended deployment of resources. And then it's also a way to have some kind of awareness. We could deter some possible strategy from people trying to cross the border, and which is relevant because we can have some real-time information, which was not the case. Just if you let me conclude with that, when I was working on space activities 15 years ago, we tried to fight against drug trafficking in the Caribbean Sea, and it was very difficult because if you use Earth observation, space Earth observation, it was very slow, in fact, to process. It took hours to have the information. If you look at the new constellation today, maybe the information is with lower accuracy, but we have such a lot of information that you can get something which is a real-time, almost real-time assessment. And so I guess the representation of how we have a militarization here is we can transfer some military tactics applied to civilian means to support some border policy, which is a landscape change for this approach. So I can elaborate if you have more time during the question. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Renaud. I will give now the floor to Philippe and Frowd and to Ken and Multu, and they will speak about the rise of border security apps. Philippe, you have the floor.
Yes, thank you very much. Today we would like to talk about what we have noticed as a trend, which is the increasing use of mobile applications in particular as part of the set of tools that is part of securing the border. And so this work that we are presenting today comes out of a project funded by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. That is John, myself, and Benjamin Muller, who couldn't be here today, who's at King's University College. And our project is asking broader questions. It's titled Securing the Border with Data, and we're asking ourselves questions about data, practices, and tools, and trying to build on some of that literature. First, by going beyond a lot of the kind of very EU-heavy literature, also trying to examine data and data practices in their social settings, and also some of the transnational ramifications of data and bordering. So, this is some information about the project itself. The term that we have used to try and capture this trend is the term appification. And so we describe this kind of appification of borders to kind of build on some of the existing work on data practices in border security, which is interested in data brokers, data sharing practices, data processing, and some of the kind of more sort of meta questions about data as a kind of epistemic object. So we're informed by some of that work, but trying also to push beyond a little bit. So many of you will have noticed, for example, traveling to the UK, for example, that there is a new app for entering some advanced passenger information. The United States has a similar one, which is up on the screen now, mobile passport control. So there are various types of apps that are out there that help the border function in different ways. So some of them are replacing what was previously like a paper application form that you would fill in at the airport, right? So ArriveCan, which began during the pandemic context, has sort of evolved into being a much more routine application in terms of filling in customs declarations. There are also more sort of robust apps, as we could say, that are actually a more direct link between the person on the move and the immigration system. So the case of CBP-1 in the United States, which is now CBP Home, it fits well within that category. Then you have apps which are not necessarily on mobile phones, but which are broader sort of software bundles that are used by border agents and border agencies. And then you also have apps that are used by humanitarian organizations and NGOs, and also by migrants themselves, right? There are even research projects that have used apps to do research on how migrants interact with various parts of the natural landscape, and so on and so forth. So how does this link to the question of border walls, right? Because the app is very different from the physical walling. But there is, for us, a kind of similarity in terms of the attempt to deploy stopping power, right? The stopping power of the physical wall also coincides with the stopping power of the application, which also enables the state to carry out control at a distance and to stop people from moving before they arrive at the international border. There is also the similar logic of selectivity, right? So in the same way that the physical border wall has a logic of selectivity, right? There is one on the border with Mexico, with the United States, but not on the border with Canada, right? So the similar logic of selectivity and profiling also fits into this question of apps. So we've identified what we refer to as 3 drivers of this process of appification. So these are broadly the infrastructural question, the need for efficiency at the border and management of limited resources, and then also a logic of individualization, which has been extensively covered in the literature on border security in terms of individualized profiling and biometric information and so on and so forth. So the question of infrastructure, which we think of as being a technological but also a bureaucratic type of system, is central to the question of thinking about why apps have become so important to policing the border, right? Part of it is that they build on existing consumer infrastructures, for example, the iOS or Android app stores, which facilitate the delivery of this mechanism, which eventually becomes a mechanism of border control. So, for example, the word platform is one that we exchanged quite a bit as we were writing the paper and as we were trying to think about what types of infrastructures we were interested in. And what we see is that the state border is building on top of not just kind of public sector platforms, but also the private sector platforms that the consumer or the border crosser is already part of and exposed to. And so this infrastructural concern is also part of the kind of dual logics. There's a logic of centralization of data and of decision making, but also of decentralization in the sense that the border is now kind of in your pocket or even in your hand. The second logic is one of efficiency or resource management. So here as well, there's a kind of strange paradox in the sense that border agencies have tremendous number of resources. I think the latest budget justification for customs and border protection in the US had a huge increase in terms of the budget, but there's also a desire to do things as cheaply as possible faced with a growing number of travelers, especially through air travel, and also managing resources and diverting resources to higher risk travelers to enable lower risk travelers to have a more seamless experience from their phone rather than with an in-person interaction. The third logic is one of individualization. And so here again, the border is moving away from a logic whereby all nationals of a particular country are subject to a similar risk profile, where profiling is much more easy to individually tailor. This has long been the case through things like racial profiling, for example, but this is even more granular in the sense that you can go down to the level of the device and its hardware. A lot of this is also driven by the COVID-19 pandemic and the pressures towards individualizing things like hygienic control. So, how the cases fit, we can't do all three drivers for all three cases. That's a 9x9 table, and I have only about 3 minutes left. So what we're going to do is kind of run through some of the cases to give an illustrative sense of what some of these apps are doing in terms of hitting on this kind of question of infrastructure, of efficiency and resources, and of individualization. So the first case that we look at is CBP-1 in the United States, clearly intended to be a one-stop shop for the American border on your phone, which is now CBP Home, which is a bit, I think the message is, please go home. CBP-1 was launched in October of 2020. So again, in the pandemic context of exceptional power at the US-Mexico border to deny entry. And CBP-1 was used for scheduling asylum appointments. Now, what's interesting here is that the infrastructure that's consumer-facing is what the app is drawing on. So firstly, it's using things like geolocation. So you could only request an asylum appointment if you were geolocated as being close enough to the US border to do so. If you're in the south of Mexico, the app would say, please move closer to the US. It also uses other smartphone hardware like the front-facing camera to detect the liveness of the person that is actually making the application. So here you have, again, the sort of public sector purpose that is surfing on a private sector distribution infrastructure and the existing hardware that is on the phone. Here we have many glitches, and I'll spend some time talking about glitches in the next case, which is the case of ArriveCan, which was launched in April 2020 by the Canadian government as a way of enforcing public health requirements at the international border. Now, much of the public discussion in Canada has been around the onerous requirements of actually having to fill things out, but also the cost of the application. It was supposed to cost $80,000 and it ended up being $60 million. And so this has been a large sort of public scandal, but there's a sort of other scandal behind it in terms of some of the glitches that were going on with this application. And one of the things that happened as travelers to Canada had to fill this in was that some people were actually wrongly told to quarantine and were actually subject to fines if they hadn't been quarantining, and the fines were up to $5,000 Canadian. And so again, glitches are part of this kind of software basis of the international border. So I'm going to jump to the final case just to be efficient with time. The final case is not a governmental one. It is the International Air Travel Association initiative called OneID. And this is where we see the interests of the private sector, airports and airlines, and the public sector for more data align quite nicely, right? And so the idea with OneID is that you will be able eventually to have seamless travel from home to your destination entirely electronically and ideally without having to use a physical document at many points. And so again, this is building on a digital infrastructure. So the International Civil Aviation Organization, which sets a lot of the standards for digital documents and international travel documents, has put together some standards on what digital travel credentials would look like. And so OneID plugs into this emerging infrastructure of travel through biometrics alone and through one's phone rather than with a paper document. And so again, the idea is that air travel numbers are going to double in the next 15 to 20 years. And so one has to manage the throughput through ways of empowering mobile travelers to do a lot of things in a self-service way through applications. So to wrap up, there are some interesting themes that come through with the question of apps in the public sector, and especially for security purposes. And one of these is around the culture of Silicon Valley, right? The idea of even leaving reviews on the App Store to complain about the state's border practices. This is something that was definitely the case with ArriveCan, but also the idea of envisioning the border crosser as a user, right? And treating them as a user the way many of your other consumer apps would do on your phone. I want to just finish with a comment that Tom Homan, who is the American border czar, made at a recent expo, a border security expo, and he said, what we would like the American border to function like is to be like Amazon Prime, right? To be as efficient as possible in deportations. And this logic carries over into thinking about apps and travel, because the people who design these apps also want to align the border experience to be like other consumer experiences, right? We want crossing the border to be as easy as ordering something from Amazon. And so the logic of convenience is absolutely there. And so I'll close with this point, is that a lot of the questions around differential access at the border are entrenched through the use of mobile applications, right? So as we saw this morning in the keynote, we see people in tears at the border having asylum appointments taken through an app canceled, but you also have, through projects like OneID, a very empowered sort of transnational upper class that is able to even more seamlessly move through international borders. I will stop there, but thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much, Philippe, for your presentation. So a big thanks and a big applause for our guests.